This isn't where you sleep. I'm a 29-year-old guy from England. Near the end of August 2014, I was out with some friends in a bar to celebrate my birthday. It was near the end of the night, and we decided it was time to go home. Having been out for going on 8 hours by this point, we were up on the first floor of the bar, and my friends went down the staircase to the main doors ahead of me. For reasons my advanced drunkenness has caused me to forget, I decide to try taking a shortcut off the stage next to the stairs instead. I'm guessing I just stepped off the stage thinking that it was a short drop to the ground, but it was closer to about 5 or 6 feet, and I hit the ground with my legs straight and my knees locked. Snap. I instantly knew something was pretty seriously wrong. Cued a 999 call and a surprisingly calm ambulance ride to the hospital after being dosed up on gas and air. At the hospital, they gave me an x-ray and discovered I'd broken both of my legs. By this point, I sort of already guessed. Your right foot pointing down instead of pointing up is a pretty good indication. And my heart sank further when the attending doctor told me they had to admit me ahead of corrective surgery in the next couple of days. By now, they've given me quite a bit of morphine, and I was still huffing gas and air, like a champ, so I was fairly out of it. A porter wheeled me up the ward and introduced me to a nurse, who explained I was going to be put in the men's ward, as they had separate genders the previous day in different rooms. I would have thought they would do this anyways, but whatever. Even out of it on pain meds, I remember thinking it was a weird thing to mention. The nurse set me up in my room, right by the ward entrance. My bed was one of the 5 in there, and next to the room's shared toilet/shower room. It was around 5 a.m. and the entire place was quiet and dark. As the nurse took me through all the omitted procedures, I could vaguely make out a guy in the bed opposite. Unlike the others in the room, he was still awake and sitting up in his bed to watch me being brought in. I couldn't see his face, but the patchy white hair on his head was catching the moonlight coming in the windows, so I guess he was an older guy. What struck me was how he still was sitting there, like a statue. No movement, no noise, nothing. Just sitting there, focused on me the whole time. Before the nurse left, I asked him to draw the curtains around me so I was shielded from view. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up the next day to find my parents had been contacted and were sitting by my bed. Standing next to them was the guy from the bed opposite, chatting away like they'd known each other for years. I'm not exactly known as a people person, and given that for obvious reasons, I was a touch grouchy. I'll admit that I was annoyed that my parents were letting a total stranger stand right over me while I was unconscious. Of course, they weren't to know that he creeped me out a little the night before. He introduced himself. Here we'll call him Mick. He seemed friendly enough, one of those harmless old men who come across as lonely and keen to talk to just about anyone. He was in his early 70s, quite short and round, and was on the ward because he'd fractured his collarbone in a fall. When he eventually wandered off, my parents told me he seemed to be a nice man, confirming that he just appeared pleased to have new people to talk to. During the course of that first day, my parents left and the doctors came round to fit me up with splints before my surgery, planned for day 3. They made it clear I'd be in the hospital for at least a week and I wouldn't be walking for a few months at least. Not what I wanted to hear. During all these conversations, Mick lurked nearby, listening in. When the doctors left, Mick came to my bedside. Rather than stand, he sat down in the chair next to me and asked me to repeat what the doctors had said. I wasn't in much of a mood to chat, and because I got it into my head that he was harmless, I asked why he needed to know, since he only stood a few feet away and must have heard everything. The second those words left my lips, his entire demeanor changed. The sweet old man that has been sitting in that chair was gone, and his face went blank, like it had flattened. He fixed me with this weird stare, and one corner of his mouth lifted into a lopsided grin. My wife just died, you know. Again, I'm not a people person, and conversations about death are way outside of my wheelhouse. I stuttered a little, trying to find appropriate words. I think I went with how sorry I was to hear that and asked how long have it been. Given the odd grin, I guess it had been a while. His face never changed the whole time. It dawned on me that maybe he wasn't totally mentally present at that point. He never broke eye contact either, just looking at me, grinning. One of those looks that isn't immediately sinister, but then goes on just a little too long. Thankfully, the nurses came in at this point to serve dinner, and Mick retreated back to his bed. He watched TV the rest of that day, and I put my iPod on, so I had an excuse not to make any more conversations. Right then, I just thought he was a little left of normal, and it was more weirdness than I could deal with. When lights out came around, I asked the nurses to draw the curtains around my bed for me. Although I was still in quite a bit of pain, I drifted off early. I woke up in what had to have been the early hours of morning. One of those gradual awakenings where you know something's not quite right, but can't work out what. The ward was almost totally dark and silent again, especially around my bed with the curtains drawn. I assumed the weird feeling was down to, being in the hospital with two epically shattered legs, and turned my head to the left onto the pillow. Then I nearly rolled off the opposite side in shock. Standing inside of the drawn curtain right next to my bed was Mick. Just stood there, watching me. Like you do when you've had a shock. I said something stupid. This isn't where you sleep. Nothing. Same blank stare, same creepy half smile. Barely a ruler length from my face. I thought he might be sleepwalking, but he didn't have the glazed look to go with it. He seemed perfectly alert, just happy to be standing there observing me. Mick, how long have you been there? I asked. That's when I got that special kind of chill you get when something really freaks you the fuck out. Rather than reply, he smiled really wide so I saw both rows of his teeth, and then shuffled back around the curtains to his own bed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Because he never really left the room, and I certainly wasn't going anywhere, I couldn't really mention it to the nurses. I did text a few friends who were visiting the next day and told them to watch out for him when they came through. He stayed away during their visit, and they said he seemed like a normal old man, which he did at that point. As the day went on, I decided I made more of it than I should have, and was just on edge because of what I had going on, being in unfamiliar surroundings and all that. That day, I went in for my surgery. I came to about 6 hours later to find myself hooked up to a morphine pump. Hands down the best medical invention ever. As a result, I was absolutely out of my tree high the entire evening and was in such a good, opiated-fueled mood. I totally forgot about Mick. Big mistake. It got to the early hours again, and I was playing a game on my phone, oblivious. Because nurses were checking me every hour or so, they disturbed the curtains around my bed a lot as they came and went. The last nurse had left a gap about 6 inches wide where the curtains met, typically right in the part opposite Mick's bed. Mick was a very, very loud snorer, and so I was reassured by those noises coming from him that he was very much asleep. I've got to assume because of the morphine. I stopped paying attention and suddenly realized that I couldn't hear the snoring anymore. I also couldn't remember how long it has been since I last heard it. I looked at the gap between the curtains, but couldn't make anything out. I was just about to go back to my game when, from just the left of the gap, I heard my name being said. Not a normal way of saying it. Not a whisper, more of a groan, almost. Low and gravelly and menacing. I froze. I mean, what's the protocol when a prisoner has gotten out of bed in the middle of the night for a second night running to mess with you? I sat, paralyzed. Well, more paralyzed than I already was, with this odd sense of vulnerability. I was immobile. I couldn't really confront him or get up and leave. I was stuck in my bed, heavy bandages and braces around both legs and hooked to an IV. I slowly moved my hand down from my phone to the call button for the nurses. Just as my hand reached it, the long groaning of my name stopped. So did my hand. Had he seen me reach for it and gone back to bed? Nope, he was still there. About 30 seconds passed, presumably the length of time it took him to be comfortable that I wasn't going to press the button. Then came the heavy breathing. Long, raspy intakes of air followed by an extended groans to expel it. Over and over and over. Right at the foot of my bed. That was my limit. I hit the call button, and the light went on above my head. I heard the buzzer sound down the hallway at the nurse's station. There was a burst of movement behind the curtains, and I heard the nearby toilet door quickly open and close. Not long afterwards, a nurse responded to the call. Mick was still in the toilet, but because it was close by, I beckoned the nurse nearer so I could whisper. I told her what had happened and about the previous night and asked if something could be done. She nodded and said she'd be right back. While she was gone, Mick emerged from the toilet and I heard him climb back into his bed. Thankfully, the nurse had fully closed my curtains, so at least he couldn't see me now. An hour passed and eventually the nurse returned. I was expecting to be moved elsewhere, but instead she told me that I couldn't have a sleeping pill due to being on morphine. I tried my best to not be impolite and I calmly told her I didn't ask for a pill. I asked for something to be done about what had happened. The last thing I wanted was to deliberately knock myself unconscious with more meds. She sorta shrugged, half explained that all of the wards were full and disappeared again, telling me to get some rest. I didn't sleep for hours. Mick's snoring eventually resumed, and the day finally caught up with me, so I cautiously allowed myself to drift off. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Mick made small talk, which I didn't really respond to, and eventually left me alone. That afternoon, a guy younger than me was admitted with a broken leg. This guy was 18, but looked about 12. It was ridiculous. Mick didn't seem to think so, because suddenly this guy was the focus of all of his attention. I felt sorry for the fresh meat, but grateful that I might be able to relax now. That night, I slept pretty well until about 3 a.m. I woke up to a weird sensation in my left foot, the toes of which were poking out of the top of the bandages. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw Mick, again stood inside of my drawn curtains, playing with my toes, running his fingers along them, pinching them, moving them around, like he wanted me to wake up and see what he was doing. But not looking at them, looking me dead in the eyes, unblinking, grinning. I'd like to say I lost my shit with him, called the nurses in and had him moved elsewhere. But the mind's a weird thing, so I didn't. I just sat open-mouthed and watched him as he kept moving my toes around. I think it was disbelief that kept me quiet, mixed with fear. He might have more than 40 years on me, but I was trapped in the bed and totally at his mercy, and so I didn't want to do anything to piss him off. Eventually, he seemed to get tired of messing with me and disappeared behind the curtains back to his own bed. For obvious reasons, I sat awake the rest of the night, watching and waiting for him to show his face again, but he didn't. Every now and then, I heard my name being groaned, low and long. By morning, I was a mixture of furious and terrified. I'm not that kind of person who assumes the role of a victim very often, and so I hated how easily this old man had reduced me to a paranoid wreck. Every time he got up to stretch his legs or get some water, my entire body went rigid, expecting him to come back to my bedside. He didn't, going back to devote all of his creepy attention to this new guy again. That afternoon, Mick was called away for a scan, and so I finally had some time to speak to the 3 other guys in the room about what had happened. None of them had any idea about Mick's nightly visits, since they were dosed up on pain meds themselves. One of the guys had been there longer than I had, though, and he had been around when the wards were divided by gender. I asked him what had happened, and he responded that he wasn't totally sure. He just knew that something had happened during the night, and the next morning, men and women were in separate wards. For obvious reasons, I had a pretty good idea of what that something might have been. When Mick got back, he glumly announced that he had been cleared to go home and had an ambulance booked to take him in there in an hour or two. He started making his way around the ward, saying goodbye to everyone. He left me until last. You look after those legs in the future. They are fragile things, Mick said. I half smiled, and because I'm crippled with English politeness, told him I hope he'd feel better soon. Assuming the interaction was done, I finally seen the last of him. I picked up a magazine and started reading. No sooner had I done that, I felt pressure around my left foot. I looked up and was about to yell out until I saw what Mick was doing. His hand was clamped around my foot, squeezing it so hard that his knuckles had gone white. Thankfully, the break on the left was further up, and that stare was back, vacant but intense with a creepy half-smile. Before I could respond, his mouth opened, and out came that same raspy voice I'd heard saying my name in the night. Very, very fragile. He let go of my foot, turned around, and shuffled back to his bed to pack. A couple of hours after that, he was gone. I did feel the nurses in before I was discharged, but none of them seemed to care at all that much, dismissing what I'd experienced as either partly drug-induced or just misinterpreted. I don't think too often about Mick these days. Now I'm back on my feet and more or less back to normal. Every so often, though, if I'm woken up in the night by a twinge in my legs, I remember those weeks in the hospital and make a little promise to myself to never wind up back there again.